In the year 2000, engineers opened a set of gates on a dying river in western China and let the water run into a desert that had been swallowing villages for 1,000 years. Nobody really knew what would happen. The lower stretch of that river had been bone dry for close to 30 years. The trees along its banks were dead standing wood. The wells in the villages downstream had turned salty. Local farmers had already started packing up and moving east. 25 years later, that same stretch of riverbed has water in it again. The dead poplars came back to life. Farmers who left have come home. And the desert, which had been advancing at a steady, terrifying pace, actually stopped and gave back ground in some places. But here is the part almost nobody outside China talks about. The water they pumped into that desert did not come from rain. It did not come from some new discovery. It came from somewhere else, and somewhere else had to go without. That is the trade nobody puts on the poster. This is the story of how China poured billions of gallons of water into one of the driest places on Earth, why it worked better than anyone expected, and why some of the smartest hydrologists in the country are genuinely worried about what happens in 50 years. To understand any of it, you have to start with the desert itself. Because the Taklamakan is not a normal desert. It is something closer to a monster. Picture a sea of sand roughly the size of Germany. That is the Taklamakan, sitting in the Tarim Basin in China's far western Xinjiang region. It is the second largest shifting sand desert on the planet, and the word shifting is doing a lot of heavy lifting there. Around 85% of it is made of dunes that move. Not slowly, not gently. Some of these dunes crawl across the landscape at rates that can bury a road, a field, or a house within a single season. There are dunes in there that stand 300 meters tall, which is roughly the height of the Eiffel Tower, made entirely of loose sand that the wind pushes around like it weighs nothing. The name itself carries a warning. The most common translation people give for Taklamakan is, "You go in and you do not come out." Scholars argue about whether that is actually accurate linguistically, but honestly, it does not matter. Everyone who lived near it understood the meaning perfectly well. Caravans on the old Silk Road did not cross the Taklamakan. They went around it, hugging the northern or southern rim, hopping between oasis towns like a person crossing a river on stepping stones. The middle was simply off limits. Rainfall in the deep interior is under 10 millimeters a year. In some spots it is closer to 4. To put that in perspective, a single decent thunderstorm anywhere in the eastern United States drops more water in one afternoon than parts of the Taklamakan receive in a decade. Meanwhile, evaporation rates in the basin run to something like 3,000 millimeters a year. That means the air is capable of sucking up 300 times more moisture than the sky ever delivers. If you poured a bucket of water on the sand at noon in July, you would be watching a stain, not a puddle, and the stain would be gone before you finished watching. So, where did anyone find water in a place like that? The answer is the mountains. Xinjiang is ringed by some of the highest peaks in the world. The Tian Shan Range to the north, the Kunlun and Karakoram to the south and west. Those mountains catch snow and hold glaciers, and every spring and summer that ice melts and comes rushing down onto the plain. Dozens of rivers pour off the slopes and head straight into the basin, and most of them simply die in the sand. They flow out for 50 kilometers, or 100, and then they are gone, absorbed and evaporated, leaving nothing but a dry channel pointing into nowhere. A handful of them, though, joined together and made something bigger. The Aksu, the Yarkand, the Hotan, all feeding into the Tarim River, which curled around the northern edge of the desert for over 2,000 kilometers before emptying into a terminal lake called Lop Nur. The Tarim is the longest inland river in China, which means it never reaches the ocean. It just runs until it runs out. Along that river, over thousands of years, something remarkable had grown. A ribbon of green forest, sometimes narrow, sometimes many kilometers wide, running through the heart of one of the harshest environments on the planet. The dominant tree there is the Populus euphratica, the desert poplar, and it is one of the toughest living things you will ever encounter. It can survive salt levels that would kill almost any other tree. Its roots reach down 10 meters or more to find groundwater. People in the region have a saying about it, that it stands for 1,000 years without dying, lies for 1,000 years without falling, and lies fallen for 1,000 years without rotting. That is folklore rather than botany, but it captures how the tree is regarded there. It is the thing that holds the line. That green corridor was not decoration. It was the physical barrier between the Taklamakan to the south and the Kurukhtag Desert to the north. As long as the forest was alive, the two deserts could not merge. The trees broke the wind, anchored the soil, and kept the dunes from marching across the gap. And then, in the middle of the 20th century, the forest started to die. The reason was not mysterious, and it was not natural. It was farming. Starting in the 1950s, huge state-organized reclamation projects moved into the Tarim Basin. Land was cleared, canals were dug, and enormous areas of desert edge were converted into cropland, mostly cotton. Xinjiang cotton eventually became a massive industry, supplying a large share of China's total production and a significant share of the world's. That cotton was thirsty. Every hectare that came under cultivation needed water pulled out of the river, and the amount of land under cultivation kept climbing decade after decade. Reservoirs went up, diversion channels were cut, pumping stations were installed. Each one was perfectly sensible on its own. Each one made a local community better off. Collectively, they drained the river. The way this plays out is horribly predictable, and it has happened on almost every continent. Upstream users take water first because they physically can. Downstream users get whatever is left. And as upstream demand grows, what is left shrinks, until eventually, the answer is nothing at all. In the Tarim's case, the numbers were brutal. In the 1950s, the river's lower reaches were still flowing. By the early 1970s, a stretch of roughly 320 kilometers at the tail end of the river had gone completely dry. Lop Nur, the terminal lake that had appeared on Chinese maps for 2,000 years, evaporated into a salt crust. Satellite images of the area from that era show what looks like a giant ear pressed into the desert, concentric rings of dried salt marking where the shoreline retreated year after year. Once the water stopped, the forest started dying from the bottom up. The groundwater table, which the poplars depended on, began dropping, first to 6 meters, then 8, then 12, then deeper than the roots could reach. Trees that had stood for centuries turned into gray skeletons. Whole stands of them died standing up, which is exactly as unsettling as it sounds. Kilometer after kilometer of dead forest. Bark pieced off. Branches bleached by the sun. And with the forest gone, the wind had nothing to slow it down. Sandstorms in the region got worse. The dunes from the north and the dunes from the south started closing the gap. Villages in the lower Tarim watched sand pile up against their walls. Farmland got buried. Wells went salty because with no fresh water flushing through, salts concentrated in whatever moisture remained. Livestock died. People left. The county of Yuli, at the tail end of the river, lost a huge share of its population over those decades. It was not a dramatic single event. It was a slow bleed, family by family, each one deciding independently that there was no future in staying. By the late 1990s, Chinese scientists were describing the situation in language that was, for official documents, remarkably blunt. The ecological corridor was collapsing. The two deserts were on track to merge. And if they merged, the consequences would not stop at the local level, because the dust and sand thrown up from the Tarim Basin travels. It travels east across China, it settles on cities, it reaches Korea and Japan, and traces of it have been detected crossing the Pacific. That was the moment when Beijing decided to do something that, on paper, sounds almost absurd. They decided to send the water back. The plan was called Ecological Water Conveyance, and the core idea was straightforward even if the execution was not. Instead of allowing every drop of the Tarim to be consumed by farms upstream, a portion would be deliberately reserved, held in reservoirs, and released down the dry channel on a schedule designed to recharge the groundwater and revive the vegetation. Not to create farmland, not to supply cities, purely to keep an ecosystem alive. This was a genuinely radical concept in water management at the time. Water in most systems is allocated to people, to crops, to industry. The idea that a river itself, or a forest, deserves an allocation was a hard sell. Somewhere upstream, a farming district was going to receive less water so that dead trees 300 kilometers away might come back. Try selling that at a public meeting. The first release happened in May of 2000. Engineers opened the gates at the Daxihaizi reservoir and let water run into a channel that had been dry for around 28 years. The initial pulse was modest by later standards, somewhere around 100 million cubic meters. Teams followed the water down the channel in vehicles, tracking how far it got and how fast it soaked in. It did not get very far that first time. The channel bed was so dry and so porous that the water simply vanished into it. The soil beneath a dead riverbed in a hyper-arid desert is essentially a sponge that has been baking for 3 decades. You cannot fill it with one bucket. So they did it again, and again, and again. Over the following years, release after release was pushed down the same channel, each one soaked in a bit further than the last, because each one had left the ground slightly less thirsty. It took multiple attempts before the water finally traveled the entire length of the dry section and reached the old lake bed at Taitama, near the edge of what had been Lop Nur. When it got there, in the early 2000s, a lake reformed. Not a huge one, and not a permanent one at first, but water sitting on the surface, in a place that had been salt and dust for a generation. Birds showed up. Nobody had planted anything. Nobody had introduced anything. Reeds came up along the margins from seeds that had been sitting dormant in the soil, waiting. Over the next 2 decades, the program continued and expanded. The cumulative totals eventually ran into the billions of cubic meters delivered down the lower Tarim, which translates into a number of gallons so large that writing it out stops being useful. What mattered more than the raw total was what the water did once it arrived. The groundwater table began to rise. In monitoring wells near the channel, levels that had fallen below 12 meters started climbing back towards 6, then 5, then in some places under 4. That number is the whole ballgame, because the desert poplar can survive if groundwater sits within roughly 4 to 6 meters of the surface. Below 8 meters, the trees are in serious trouble. Below 10, they die. And once the water table crossed back over that threshold, the forest responded. Old trees that looked completely dead pushed out new shoots. Root systems that had been dormant for years sent up suckers. Seeds that had been lying in the soil germinated when the ground finally stayed damp long enough. The vegetation belt along the channel widened from a thin, dying strip to something measured in kilometers. This is one of the most striking things about the whole project, and it is worth pausing on. Almost nobody had to plant those trees. The recovery was largely natural regeneration. The ecosystem was not gone. It was in suspension, waiting for one missing input. Give it back the water, and it rebuilt itself. The farmers in Yuli and the surrounding areas were the ones who noticed first, and by most accounts, they were genuinely stunned. People who had grown up watching the river die were now watching it come back within their own lifetime. Wells that had gone salty started to freshen as the rising groundwater diluted the accumulated salt. Pasture returned in places that had been bare sand. Herders who had been forced to buy fodder could graze again. There is a detail here that I find more convincing than any statistic. Some families who had moved away came back. Not many, and not everywhere, but enough that local officials started reporting it. People do not move their families back into a marginal desert county on the strength of a government press release. They move back because a cousin called and said the grass is growing again. Now, if the story ended there, it would be a tidy environmental success and we could all go home. It does not end there, and this is where it gets more interesting and considerably more uncomfortable. The water that revived the lower Tarim did not appear from nowhere. Every cubic meter released down that channel is a cubic meter that did not go onto a cotton field somewhere upstream. That means the entire project depends on somebody, somewhere, using less. And in Xinjiang, the pressure to use more has never stopped. Cotton acreage in the region has continued to expand over much of this period. Population has grown, industry has grown, the demand curve points in exactly the wrong direction for a program that requires spare water to exist. The way China has tried to square that circle is through efficiency, and the scale of that effort is genuinely impressive, even if you are skeptical of everything else. Xinjiang has become one of the largest users of drip irrigation on the planet. Instead of flooding a field and letting most of the water evaporate or sink past the root zone, farmers run plastic tubing under mulch film directly to the plants, delivering water drop by drop, often mixed with fertilizer. Millions of hectares have been converted. The water savings per hectare are large, sometimes cutting consumption by a third or more compared to flood irrigation. Canals have been lined with concrete to stop seepage. Older open channels lost enormous volumes just soaking into the ground on the way to the field. Water pricing and quota systems have been introduced to make waste expensive rather than free. Here is the trap though, and it is a trap that irrigation engineers have known about for over a century. It is sometimes called the efficiency paradox, and it goes like this. When you make water use more efficient, farmers do not usually take the savings and hand them back. They plant more. If drip irrigation lets you grow the same cotton on 2/3 of the water, the rational move for an individual farmer is to use that freed up third to expand the field. Multiply that by every farmer in the basin, and total consumption can actually rise, even though every single farm is technically more efficient than before. There is decent evidence this has happened to some degree in Xinjiang. Efficiency improvements have been partly eaten by expansion, which means the water available for ecological release is not as secure as the headline numbers suggest. It has to be defended, administratively, every single year, against 100,000 perfectly reasonable requests to use it for something that produces food and income. There is a second problem that gets even less attention, and it is the one that keeps hydrologists up at night: groundwater. Surface water is visible. You can see a river, you can measure a reservoir, you can film a canal. Groundwater is invisible, and in Xinjiang, there has been an enormous amount of well drilling over the past several decades. Farmers who could not get reliable surface allocations drilled. When their shallow wells ran dry, they drilled deeper. Some of the aquifers being tapped in the basin are what hydrologists call fossil water, meaning it accumulated during wetter climatic periods thousands of years ago and is not being meaningfully recharged today. Pumping it is not farming, it is mining. So, when you look at the greening of the lower Tarim, you have to ask the uncomfortable question of what is actually underwriting it. Some of it is real reallocation and real efficiency. Some of it may be borrowed against an account that does not refill. And then there is the glacier problem, which is the biggest one of all. Every drop of water in the Tarim system originates as snow and ice in the surrounding mountains. Those glaciers are shrinking. Warming in high-altitude Central Asia has been faster than the global average, and glacial retreat across the Tian Shan has been documented extensively. In the short term, this actually increases river flow, because you are getting the normal meltwater plus additional water from the ice reserve itself melting away. That produces a deceptive period of abundance. Then the reserve runs low, and flow drops off, and it does not recover. Different studies put the turning point at different dates, and the honest answer is that nobody knows precisely when it arrives for the Tarim. But the direction is not in dispute. The mountain water bank that funds the entire basin, farms and forests alike, is being drawn down, which means that every ecological gain in the lower Tarim is, in a sense, provisional. It works as long as the mountains keep delivering. If the mountains deliver less, the same fight over allocation happens all over again, only with a smaller pot. Now, while all of this was going on in the Tarim, China was running a completely different desert experiment, about 2,000 kilometers to the east, and the contrast between the two is instructive. The Kubuchi Desert in Inner Mongolia is much smaller than the Taklamakan, roughly 18,000 square kilometers, and critically it sits right next to the Yellow River. It also sits uncomfortably close to Beijing, which is a fact of enormous political significance. For decades, spring sandstorms out of the northern deserts would roll into the capital and turn the sky orange. When the seat of national government is getting sandblasted every March, budgets appear. The Kubuchi effort ran differently. It leaned less on massive water transfers and more on mechanical and biological stabilization, plus a commercial model. The signature technique is the straw checkerboard. Workers lay dry, straw, or reeds in a grid across a dune face, pushing the middle of each line down into the sand so the ends stick up. You end up with a pattern of squares, roughly a meter across, covering the whole slope. It looks like a giant sheet of graph paper drawn on the desert. The physics is simple and elegant. Loose sand moves because wind at the surface picks up grains and bounces them along, and each bouncing grain knocks more grains loose. The checkerboard breaks that chain. Wind hitting the raised straw edges gets disrupted into turbulence, loses energy near the surface, and drops its load. The dune stops migrating. Then, inside the protected squares, you plant shrubs, drought-hardy species with deep roots that can survive on very little. Once those establish, they take over the job the straw was doing, and the dune is fixed permanently. It is not high technology. It is enormously labor-intensive. And it works. Over roughly 30 years, a large share of the Kubuchi was stabilized and revegetated, and the project became the poster child that gets shown at international conferences. The commercial layer is what made it stick. Companies were brought in and given reasons to care beyond goodwill. Licorice root was planted, which fixes nitrogen in the soil and has real value in traditional medicine. Solar farms were built across stabilized sand, generating power in a place with abundant sunshine and worthless land, with the panels themselves providing shade that reduces evaporation underneath, allowing plants to grow between the rows. Tourism developed around desert resorts. That combination, ecology plus revenue, is why it did not quietly fall apart the moment the initial funding cycle ended, which is the fate of an enormous number of well-intentioned desert restoration projects worldwide. China's broader response to desertification, the program often called the Three North Shelter Belt or the Great Green Wall, has been running since 1978 and is scheduled to continue until 2050. Tens of billions of trees have been planted across the north of the country. Official figures report that China has moved from net loss of land to desertification to net gain, reversing a trend that had been running the wrong way for decades. I want to be careful here, because this program has drawn substantial and legitimate criticism, including from Chinese scientists. Early phases planted enormous monocultures of fast-growing poplar. Those plantations looked spectacular for about 15 years, and then, in many areas, died in large numbers. The reasons were straightforward in hindsight. Fast-growing trees drink heavily, and in a semi-arid environment, they drew down soil moisture faster than it could be replenished. Monocultures are also fragile. When a pest arrived, and one did, it moved through the uniform stands with nothing to slow it down. There is a hard lesson in that. And to their credit, later phases of the program shifted. More native species, more shrubs and grasses rather than trees, more attention to whether a site can actually support what is being planted long-term. So how do you actually judge the Taklamakan and Tarim story, taking all of this together? I think you have to hold two things in your head at once, and resist the urge to collapse them into one clean verdict. The first thing is that the Ecological Water Conveyance Program in the Lower Tarim is a real, measurable, physically verifiable success. The groundwater rose. That is not a claim, it is a well reading. The vegetation returned. That shows up in satellite imagery that anybody can look at. The dry channel carries water. Taitama Lake exists again. Species that had vanished from the lower reaches came back on their own. A corridor that was on track to disappear entirely is functioning again. The desert merger that scientists were warning about in the 1990s did not happen. That is not nothing. That is an enormous amount of something. And there is a broader point buried in it that applies far beyond China. The recovery happened mostly through natural regeneration. The ecosystem was not destroyed, it was dormant. That is genuinely hopeful information about degraded arid land everywhere, because it means the cost of restoration in some places may be far lower than assumed. You do not always have to rebuild. Sometimes you just have to stop taking and wait. The second thing you have to hold is that this is a managed system, not a restored one, and the difference matters enormously. A restored river runs because the water cycle sustains it. The lower Tarim runs because a government agency decides, every year, to release a specific volume from a specific reservoir on a specific schedule. If that decision changes, the water stops. If the political priority shifts, the water stops. If a drought year forces hard choices between cotton and trees, we all know which way that vote goes in most of the world most of the time. The forest is alive on an annual subscription, and underneath the whole arrangement sits the glacier question, which no amount of administrative competence can solve. You cannot manage your way out of a shrinking water supply. You can only allocate the shortage more or less intelligently. There is also a genuine tension in the framing that I think deserves to be said out loud. When these projects get presented internationally, the story is usually greening, restoration, humans healing the desert, but a substantial portion of what happened in the Tarim was not humans healing the desert. It was humans partially undoing damage that humans had caused 60 years earlier by draining a river to grow cotton. That is a worthy thing to do. It is also a different thing from conquering nature. And the difference is not just semantic. One version teaches you to be careful with what you take. The other teaches you that you can always engineer your way out afterward. The engineering out of it version is more flattering and considerably more dangerous, because the Tarim was recoverable largely by luck. The desert poplar happens to be absurdly resilient. The seed bank happened to survive. The aquifer happened to still be there to recharge. Push a different ecosystem past a different threshold, and the water might come back to find that there is nothing left to revive. Where does this go from here? Several directions at once, and some of them are getting strange. Xinjiang has expanded aquaculture in the desert, raising fish and shrimp in inland ponds using brackish groundwater treated to resemble seawater. Fish farming in the Taklamakan sounds like a joke, and it is not. In late 2024, China completed a protective belt running the full perimeter of the Taklamakan, a green ring roughly 3,000 kilometers around, combining planted vegetation, straw checkerboards, gravel barriers, and solar arrays. It does not green the interior. Nobody is greening the interior of the Taklamakan, and anybody who tells you otherwise is selling something. What it does is stop the edges from advancing onto the oases and infrastructure that ring the basin, which is the part that actually matters for the people living there. For now, the lower Tarim runs. The poplars are leafing out along a channel that spent nearly 3 decades as dust. Herders graze animals on land that was bare sand within living memory. Somewhere in Yuili County, an older farmer can walk his grandchildren to a riverbank that did not exist when he was their age. That is a genuine achievement, accomplished not through any miracle technology, but through the deeply unglamorous work of deciding, year after year, to leave some water in the river. The open question is whether that decision survives the next 50 years. As the glaciers thin and the demands multiply and every cubic meter gets fought over by people with entirely legitimate claims, the desert did not go anywhere. It is still there, still the size of Germany, still full of dunes 300 meters tall waiting for the wind. It was never defeated. It was negotiated with, and negotiations have to be renewed. If you got something out of this, subscribe. We break down the infrastructure and engineering stories that shape how the world actually works. Every week, there are more videos on screen right now. One question before you go. If reviving that forest means some farmer upstream grows less cotton and earns less money, is that a fair trade? Tell me where you land in the comments.